Hello, everybody. This is LifeWorks Ministries. I'm Gary Howington, and this is the place where we get together and we talk about where faith and society and culture intersect. Looking forward to a great time to visit with you. Enjoy.
Bishop, today I was wanting to talk to you about a subject that we had a question that was put forth when we were talking about doing this vlog, this podcast, whatever we want to label it. But one of the main questions was, what is, as a person living in the world today, how does God's grace or human will kind of not conflict, but how do they compare to one another in a world where the view between the Christian faith and the view of the world has widened or began to take a gap between one another at great lengths, and both of these views strive quite often to make the world a better place. The Bible, on one hand, suggests that we're supposed to trust in God and believe in His help and His grace, while the secularists believe that they can do it all by themselves through laws or policies or education or by secular means or physical means. How do we kind of take those things, and how would you break that down more or less?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and the first thing that comes to my mind with the posing of a question like that is that everybody, we would hope that everybody or the majority of our culture and our society would be wanting to try to better society and to better the human experience and the human condition. I guess the real question is, how do we go about achieving those goals, and how do we go about attaining those goals? As Christians, you mentioned that we walk according to the scriptural mandates. We walk in a dimension that we as Christians call faith, and we say that we trust God. We use the parameters of His Word as the template for our lives. We let the precepts that we find there about morality, about social interaction, about how we engage in commerce in society and engage with each other in society, our values for honesty and integrity and our conduct, business, whatever realm you want to talk about, are basically founded within the parameters of the precepts of the Word of God. And a lot of times secularists think that we are being oblivious to some other things, such as the value of education, the value of a set of rules and laws and so forth. Well, I think that's a misconception myself. I don't think that society has properly understood perhaps the faith perspective, because no one that I know, no one that is reasonable and no one that is rational that embraces a faith life or the life of Christian faith would tell you that there's not value in some of the things that secularists would try to say makes culture and society better. In other words, a man that walks by faith wouldn't say that we don't need to educate ourselves. Yeah. He wouldn't say that we don't need to have certain societal parameters that we put in place for laws and to govern society and culture. You can't have a civilization. You can't have a large body of human beings that gather together and live in close proximity to one another and live in the framework of a society without there being some rules and some laws. Yeah. And I think that oftentimes secularists have taken it to the other extreme. They say that you people of faith, you simply want to live by an old antiquated book that is outdated, and it deals with the society and culture from thousands of years ago, and it's not relevant anymore. But on the other hand, when you take secularism to its extreme ends, you find a lot of people branch out and they get to the extreme edge where it's almost like it's lawless, where whatever you want to do is okay, and societies can't function like that. You mentioned the idea of education, of business practices and economy and laws and rules governing society. Well, the way I see that is that all of those things are necessary, but faith is an element that makes it work. And I guess what I'm trying to say by that, Devin, is this: if enlightened thinking or innovative technological thinking was the solution, then all of the ancient societies and cultures would have prospered and done well. But we find out that just about every society that totally vacated faith principles and embraced secular principles, they wind up all basically in the dustbin of history somewhere, because somewhere along the line it broke down. What that tells me is that the elements of Christian faith, Bible precepts, are a certain measure that of value that has to be in a society, whether you believe specific doctrines or whether you don't. That's to as a Christian minister, I believe there are certain biblical doctrines that are absolutes.
Yeah.
But just in the context of the Judeo-Christian laws that we live by in our society here in Western civilization, modern day North American continent, the United States of America, people say, well, we don't need to live by that old book of faith, the Bible, anymore. But thou shalt not kill is still a pretty good commandment.
Yeah.
Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not lie. What does that do? That puts parameters of behavior in place in a society, which, when they are lived by, gives us a rule of thumb as to what we could possibly expect from our fellow man. And when we don't have that in place, then suspicion and mistrust always rises up, because if there's not a uniform set of values, and history has proven to us that the value systems that are contained in the Bible and its precepts are things that work.
Yeah, it's like the old Jewish principle from Genesis. It talks about that, in the beginning of times, it was taken that was chaos. It was bringing order. It was bringing a root of order and structure back to the world in the beginning of creation. When God brought those things into order, it was bringing chaos into order. It was bringing the lack of having structures and roots and more or less having principles into a place of having those things. It's the old Jewish belief on some of those things too.
Well, I don't think that the secularist idea, and there again, I'm not trying to demonize people who reject the biblical faith, because that's not the purpose of biblical faith, is to demonize those who don't adhere. It's to try to convince those that don't adhere to it and don't embrace it. It's to try to convince them that it is a viable and a good way to live. So I'm not trying to demonize secularists in any measure, but what I find out is that sometimes the secularist, and when I say secularist, I'm talking about people who don't want the Bible principles to be in place in their life. Yeah, they don't want that to be part of the mainstream culture, but everything about our society and our culture breaks down if there's no parameters. And we've talked about this in previous visits here at Life Works Ministries, about how without certain boundaries and parameters, things just will devolve. You can build a nice, beautiful home and move into it and never replace a light bulb, or never repair a broken glass, or never paint any of the surfaces, and come back 15 or 20 years later, if there's been nothing done to maintain that thing, it will be in a state of decline. It will be in a state where it will be moving, because everything in culture, not in culture, but everything in creation moves from order to disorder. Except what God put in place. The Bible says He took disorder and made order. When man's will is exerted on it without the influences of God, man's will always makes something that it's best at its inception and falls away from that. People look around and they say, how did the world get so dark, and how did we get to the place where our society is like it is in 2018? And we see a lot of divisiveness, a lot of dark things going on in our world, a lot of things that people say there's the moral decency has faded away from our culture. Well, that's because without a set of parameters that points us toward what we as people of faith say is the creation principle, God moved it from disorder to order.
That's right.
And when you leave it in the hands of man without those influences remaining in place, then it's naturally going to decline. Just like a house or a building that was built and never maintained, it fell apart to decay and it fell into decay. And that's the same thing that's going on in society today. I'm not negative about that because for those of us who choose to embrace those Christian values and principles, we are maintaining the structure.
That's right. With or without them.
Yeah, and it's not that we're wanting to be exclusive, and it's not that we're wanting to be moralist and self-righteous people that point a finger and say everybody that doesn't live like us, we're superior to you. We're just saying that that this is how we want to live, and we want the right to be able to do that. We don't want a culture that legislates man's will into our lives and mandates that we set aside something that we found that works for us.
Yeah. It makes me think about something I heard. It was talking about. I don't remember if I heard it directly from the guy or if it was a quote from the guy, but talking about I think it was Glenn Beck, and it was talking about technology and things. And he's a conservative. Shouldn't say right winger, but he's a conservative man. But he's a leader in thought in some forms. But anyways,
he has influences.
Yeah, he has good influences and certain perspectives. But he was talking about nanotechnology, and he's talking about the world today. Coming to a place where they're trying to get technology where we used to have just AI. They're trying to create, AGI or AIG. I might be misquoting that, but anyways, he was talking about making technology. They're trying to make culture, make technology to a point where they can even heal diseases and be able to take care of all sicknesses. Where there's a utopia, more or less, where they come to a place where man no longer has to work, where man no longer gets sick anymore. And the point being that they're almost getting to a place, and this is on mainstream media, this is on mainstream news, this is on scientific news. You can look it up where they're talking about trying to create, and they can see it in the foreseeable future in the 10, 15 years of being actually able to do this stuff in a distant future. And it's almost like they're getting to a place where they're trying to get to a place where they don't need God anymore. They don't need a belief in a faith system anymore. Back to the point of, I think it comes back to a root nature, in our nature and humanity, where we have to have a desire, not a desire, but an inner nature to need God, to have a desire to fall back on a higher being, a higher power, and to follow certain principles. And I think that our culture is trying to get itself positioned to a place where they are no longer in need of something like that, where they can say, all right, we're a utopia, we're an island to ourselves, and we don't need any help from anybody else outside of our own power and our own ability to fix things. And I think it's a dangerous place, because like you talked about societies earlier, our societies are always trying to position themselves to where they need less help from something of a higher power or a power that's greater than they are, trying to make themselves the greatest, the top people in the sphere of influence or the sphere of power in the world.
Well, I think that you're probably accurate in that assessment, but I think that the concept, the premise, is fallacy. Myself, I think the premise is fallacy, and here's why I would say that, because and I know we're here for the purpose of discussing where faith intersects culture, but the premise that we would ever get to the place where we didn't need our faith perspective will show me historically, societally, how has that ever worked. In the ancient cultures, some of the greatest philosophical thinkers that still to this day are studied because of their influences: Plato, Euripides, Socrates, Aristotle, all of these great thinkers of past cultures, they had transcendent philosophical perspectives about things. And they had these vistas of thought that were just so grandiose. They just would exalt the human mind to a place. But the practical application of that was never truly discovered. When you look at what they thought and how they spoke philosophically in their age and in the era they lived in, and you look at how public life was conducted politically, governmentally, economically, socially, in those cultures, you find that there was great disparity. So the idealist who says that there is this possibility that somehow or another we're going to elevate ourselves to this utopian place. I find that premise to be a fallacy. I just don't see that being the case. And one of the reasons I say fallacy is because they say we want to get society to the place where perhaps we wouldn't need. I think Karl Marx called it the opiate of the masses. That's how he referred to religion, especially Christianity, as the opiate for the masses.
That's right.
Well, my point is this: are we really getting our culture and our society to that place, or are we just shifting what it is that they look to and depend upon? Because in Western society, Europe, and in North America, in the United States of America, the trends for the last 50 years, all of my life, have been toward not toward there being less dependencies, just shifting the place of where that dependency is. Our society today, Brother Devin, has gotten to the place where oftentimes what is viewed as being compassionate is giving something to someone, but my idea, and I find this principle in the Bible, is telling people that if you'll approach life from this perspective, you won't always have to be looking to another human being to give you something, or some conventional machination of society, some government entity or some social entity to do something for you, where you can actually take control of your life and appropriate these precepts and learn to do some things for yourself.
Yeah.
And I know some people say that's just cold and dispassionate. Well, I there again, I disagree with that as a life view. I think the most glorious thing you could do for somebody is teach them a way to live that improves their lives and doesn't shift their dependency just from one thing to another. Yes, we look to God, but God's plan has always been that I'm going to give you a set of precepts to live by, and when you appropriate these correctly, the benefits are inherent in that. Intrinsically, it has value in and of itself, whereas our society's taught us that the only thing that's compassionate is if you give something or do something for somebody, whereas God's principles say, I want to teach you a way to live that'll help you do something for yourself.
Depend on my principles, yeah.
Right.
Rather than
something that's inside of you that motivates your actions and improves your life organically.
Yeah. In the terms of thinking about that utopia that they're trying to create, and I know our world is trying to create a utopia because that's what they would love to have, is nobody to ever have to go to work again, and everybody to make,
and nobody to ever die or be
nobody
sick,
to ever die, ever get sick,
or sadness.
I was listening to somebody talking about a certain they got shows and such where they try to create things where people live eternally in a conscious mindset and just swap things around, so to speak. But anyways, though, on the point of the utopia, do you think that even if they were able to create that, and I've always heard, and always knew through the little life experience that I've had, that men have to have something to achieve and work for, not just men but mankind has to have something to work for, to have purpose in life.
There has to be a reason to live.
If that was a utopia, we wouldn't have a purpose anymore, so to speak, in that sense, would we?
If people could live forever in utopia, and there was no poverty, and there was no sickness, would that eliminate what we see all around us in our culture and our society, where human beings' personal engagement with one another is basically where some of the biggest problems and sadness and sorrow comes? Just give you an example, and I know this is probably a sensitive subject, but if you've got a beautiful, perfect society where people have just for argument's sake or for the sake of philosophical meandering, let's think about, they got a beautiful, perfect society. Nobody's ever sick. Nobody ever has to work. Everybody has adequate income. Is that going to stop physical abuse from one human being to another? Is it going to stop divorce? Is it going to
Yeah.
stop? Is it going to stop prejudices? Is it going to stop bigotries? And if it's not, then uh, how are we going to get inside individual humans and collectively make a society what it needs to
That's
be
good.
when every person would have to get on the same page and embrace the same things for it to be utopian, nobody to ever be sad, then nobody would ever be able to decide they didn't love this person anymore, or they
Yeah.
didn't want to be in this relationship anymore, because that's where the root of a lot of people's pains and problems and hurts come from. Are we going to figure out some way to go inside the person and transform the human spirit?
Well, then we don't have the person anymore.
Well, if we transform the human spirit, we've gotten back to the realm of faith, and that's what we say.
Yeah.
As people of faith, that's what we say. There is an experience that can transform the human experience and transform the human spirit, but it has to be embraced one person at a time and employ that in society, even if it means you're swimming against the current and you're doing something different than everybody else, because you can't change. Well, in a perfect society, what if someone conceives a child and they don't want that child?
Yeah. Still got the same issues we got today.
You still got the same issues that cause pain and problem. So where do you really start with the quote unquote, and I don't know if utopia would even be a proper vernacular or proper term for what we're discussing here, but where do you start? Because in order for that to really be what the secularists would desire, then you've got to go inside that person's emotions, their psychological makeup, their spiritual makeup, for lack of a better way of expressing it, and you've got to change that.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing that I've ever seen in my years, and the only thing I've ever seen historically that can do that, is something transcendent. And that, there again, like I say, that takes us full circle back to the idea that there's some higher purpose, some higher power, and there's a higher purpose for living. And
Well,
it's intrinsically has to be changed one person at a time from the inside out.
can't get away from it.
No, you can't. Even if all the utopia in the world will not change human will.
That's right.
And if you don't
That's a
change
good
human,
point.
if you don't
That's a
change
good
human will, utopia is a fallacy.
Um, and I know this is probably leading to another segment almost, but I was listening. I was thinking about this while you was talking about that. We live in a culture today where there's less poverty, less child hunger than there's ever been, less war than there's ever been, less of any of the bad things you could think of. Okay. But we still live in a society. There was a statistic that just come out, and I'd have to re-verify it, and I could look it up real quick. But there was a statistic that just come out that youth suicide was still at an all-time high compared to last year's. Now, answer me, riddle me that, answer me that. Why in a world where everything's better, everybody has air conditioning, everybody has cars now, everybody has cell phones, everybody has internet, everybody, and I'm saying that broadly. I know everybody doesn't, but for the large majority of people in the world, they live better than they've ever lived.
Yeah.
So answer me why in a world today, why we have young people, teenagers, young people
taking their
who are
lives.
taking their lives at larger swaths and larger numbers than ever before. Why do we have that kind of issue going on? Like you said, we was talking about utopia a while ago. We still have an intrinsic issue with the makeup of humanity
Right.
that's missing
Right.
something
Right.
in our core being.
Right.
And I think that and I was listening to a man that was talking about this study actually, and he said the lowest rates of those suicide rates are in people who live a religious lifestyle, rather it be Jewish, rather it be any kind of
They have
religion,
some faith.
anything.
They have some faith
Christianity, yes,
system that points them toward something
something that
higher
gives them
that they
something
live for.
more to live for, a
Right.
purpose. Like we was talking about, a purpose to live for. That gives them something deeper to live for. So answer, maybe elaborate on that a little bit. Why do
Well,
you think that is?
I think that the assertion that you made about the affluence of our culture, I've had opportunity in the years of ministry gone by that I've had time opportunities to extensively travel. I say extensively travel, much more than the average person,
Yeah, I'd say.
and I would say,
Mm-hmm.
and what I have found out is that only in Western society, the United States of America specifically, can you uh, be living in a nice, with a nice roof over your head, in an air conditioned home with a color television, a car, and a cell phone, and adequate food and clothing and medical attention,
Mm-hmm.
and be considered to be
Poverty.
poor.
Yeah.
And I'm not deriding or denigrating the poverty concept in America. I realize that poverty can't be measured simply by the factors that we use sometimes.
Yeah,
But I have seen places around the world in Asia, and specifically in Asia, that were places where uh, uh, the we can't imagine living in our modern day everyday life in the good old USA. We can't imagine the deprivations compared to us
Mm-hmm.
that those people have sometimes. But here's the thing: your question was about why do certain sociological things happen, suicides and such. It's because you can't really measure a person's wealth simply by how much material possession that they have. That's not a good measure of things. I heard one man made a quote, and he said that money was a great tool, but it was a terrible taskmaster. Taskmaster.
Yes.
And when we look at the world as a zero-sum game, and we look around and we compare ourselves to somebody else, well, there's always going to be somebody that's going to have uh, the $20 million yacht that you and I don't have.
Yeah, of course.
There's always going to be people that are going to have things that other people don't have, and I think to set those things up as the pinnacle of how to measure success. I believe in human dignity, and I believe everybody, in a wealthy country like this, I don't believe that we ought to have people starve to death, but I don't see starving people. I don't see that the machinations of our society and the things that we've got in place. I don't see mass starvation. They say there's so much hunger in America. Uh, we don't see people starving in the streets
You have to
of
define
America.
hunger.
Yeah, you have to define. Now, that's
What you're
all.
calling
All of
hunger.
those things are relative terms, and I think that for the most part, we need to understand that the real measure of success in a person's life is not measured simply by the material possessions that they have. But there again, it gets back to the idea: do I have something bigger than myself, a larger than life dynamic in place in my life that I use as the template for how I'm going to live, that points me towards something bigger than just how to than measuring stuff by how much material possession I have.
Mm-hmm. And that's something I've heard you talk about before in the years of being under your ministry and your tutelage. But I've heard you talk about that where you grew up in Wisner, or where you would grow up. We live in a more rural area, but you'd see somebody sitting on the front porch, tin roof, no air conditioner, chickens in the yard, and be as happy as all get out.
Yeah.
And but you have somebody else down the road, millionaire, and they've been divorced 3 times and upset and don't know their kids. Their kids don't have a relationship with them, and the reason being is somewhere along the way you have to weigh the options of what is important enough for you to make you happy. I guess what
Yeah.
makes you happy, or what
What
is gonna make you happy.
what makes you happy and what gives you a goal to live for. Let me give you an example that comes to mind when you say that. Just about everybody that you see in society has a smartphone or some device, maybe not specifically a smartphone, but they have a device in their pocket, and sometimes they use it to telephone people.
Yeah,
But really, what it is a small computer in their
that's right.
pocket, and with the right understanding of that technology and an affordable data package that they can get because of all the technological advancement that we have, they can type in a few little letters on a keypad, and they can find the answers to any question that they could possibly conceive. If they want to study astronomy or mathematics or calculus, or they want to figure out how to build a swimming pool or ride a bicycle, they can find all of that stuff there. But what do most people do with that? In their hands, is a tool that would absolutely open the door to extraordinary insight, knowledge, and understanding. But most people use them for something trivial like tweeting silly stuff back and forth between one another, or playing video games or something like that. And you say, well, what's your point? My point is that there has to be something that motivates you to want something higher and better. I grew up in a very rural setting, didn't realize a lot of things about the larger world around me as a small boy. And when I sit in my home at night and I have my phone and I'm reading the news or looking at the weather or answering emails or chatting with one of my friends via text message or FaceTiming with some of my people that live on the other side of the nation from me,
Yeah.
and all of that, those kind of things were unbelievable and unimaginable to a boy growing up in rural Louisiana 50, 60 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth of the matter is, uh, that same device can answer just about any question in the natural world that I want, but yet we don't always use it for high and lofty things.
Yeah.
And I think that what we need to understand is that the pursuit of our lives needs to include trying to find something that elevates our minds and our thoughts and takes us to a place in our inner man where we're convinced and persuaded that there's something bigger and transcendent that's in creation, and to aspire to that. Because personal anecdote, and I guess it'll be all right since this is our vlog for me to use a personal anecdote. I know what it did for me. The idea that these precepts led to an enlightenment was a very motivational thing for me. It started me on a journey that the further I go into it, the more I realize that I'm just scratching the surface of all the exquisiteness and beauty that it has to offer, and all of the enrichment of life, and enrichment of life. That's really what we're looking for, isn't it?
Yes.
So
Looking for happiness and
yeah, enrichment of our lives, happiness, to enjoy our families and to enjoy our lives. And you say, well, I could do that if I didn't have all these problems. Well, what we try to convince people of, and what we try to propagate, is that you can have that in spite of all the problems and the struggles that go on. You can not to eliminate those things, but go on and then have an enjoyable life, an enlightened life, in spite of all that.